Tell us about something that isn't nuanced then. Your ejection.
Right. Yes, you often ask about memorable sorties. So the background to the sortie, I have left the front line. I am an instructor pilot up on the Tornado conversion units. So as an instructor pilot, would do the ab initio. So first tour guides, conversion to the aircraft type. But I would also do check rides, as I had done on the frontline squadrons, check rides on pilots every year. So it was a day check, a night check by day, a night check as well, and also the instrument flying test. And so that sort of stuff would be done in a trainer variant of the Tornado. So we haven't really alluded to that. I mean, the difference is really it's just one TV screen slightly offset. We've got replicated controls in the back seat, so stick, throttles, wing sweep. We could only drop the gear by the blowing it down on the emergency system, and we had some override switches on the thrust reverse. But there was enough. I could land the airplane from the back seat, and we practiced that occasionally. But for the rest of it, it was the trainer version was often used if we were short of assets on our frontline squadron, and it was also something that could be used not on a war role, but if you're on peacetime training, you needed the airframe to make up the numbers. You would still use the trainer aircraft. So the sortie profile was one of these acceptance checks. It was a pilot check on somebody who'd come off the front line and was joining the conversion unit as a staff pilot, and he had some leave, having come back from an operational deployment and hadn't flown for a while. Generically, the sortie profile involved a bit of low level, a trip to the weapons range for some delivery profiles, including the toss attack I talked about in one of the previous episodes. That's kind of a handling exercise, and also made up part of the instrument rating test. So we did some of that. We did some of the high angle of attack handling that we talked about with the spin prevention and incidence limiting system. We do swept approach, and then into the circuit for doing degraded flight control system work and single engine circuits, but say single engine with the one engine throttle back to idle. So the sortie had progressed normally. We're getting towards the end of it, and we've rejoined the circuit, having done the swept approach to overshoot. And we turned downwind and he puts the gear down. In the Tornado, when the gear goes down, it goes through a self-test. It's got two gains, one high gain for taxiing on the ground where you need a wider deflection on the nose wheel. I think it's plus or minus 60 degrees from memory, but clearly that's too much on the takeoff roll and landing roll. So a low gain is automatically selected when you put the gear down. But once the gear's gone down, it goes through a test, and we got a warning that it hadn't gone through the test, and so the drills reflected trying to ascertain if the nose wheel was straight or whether it was kind of cocked off to the side. So I put a pan call out to air traffic control, and that really just alerted them that something was slightly amiss, and they stood to the fire services. And we called downwind for the option of either a full stop landing or a touch and go. So the procedure was to fly a normal circuit, lower the nose wheel onto the runway. Normally, compressing the nose wheel oleo would bring everything to life. The nose wheel steering would engage in low mode, and you would complete a landing. If the nose wheel steering system didn't come to life and it's effectively free casting, you'd go around again, stay in the closed pattern, leave the gear down, and then drop the hook and land into the approach end cable. It was the best way, if there's no nose wheel steering, to stop the aeroplane that way. If you're using thrust reverse and the nose wheel steering is not engaged and the nose wheel is free casting, you could have some challenges maintaining directional control, because you're really just left with the rudder and then differential braking. So in that situation, if you didn't have a cable available to you, for example, diverting to a civilian airport, then you would use aerodynamic braking down to about 100 knots, and then just try your best to keep it on the runway with the rudder and differential braking. So we call turning finals for the option, and we touch down, lower the nose wheel, and it comes to life. So it's all good. Also, I thought. And so at this point, I'll share the screen and show you a bit about the tornado and the thrust reverse and how it can affect the directional control of the aircraft. So this is a picture of the aircraft on the ground with the thrust reverse buckets deployed. Slightly artificial because you would never have the air brakes, which are up here, out at the same time. There was an interlock that if the air brakes were out and you deployed the thrust reverse, that the air brakes would stow automatically. So with the tornado, the brakes are rubbish. The primary stopping aid really was the thrust reverse. You could stop on the brakes, but they would likely overheat and either lose effectiveness or overheat the tyres to the extent that a fusible plug would blow and the tyres deflate. So with that in mind, after vacating the runway, the SOP was to split the throttles. The gearbox logic would see that as an engine failure and close a clutch that could link the two gearboxes before shutting an engine down. So in this way, you would generally taxi back on the right-hand engine. The left one is shut down, but the clutch is engaged, and the right-hand engine drives both gearboxes. You retain all your utilities, your generators, your hydraulics, and the like. There were some unreliabilities with the thrust reverse system. Occasionally, it would fail. You had an override switch that would allow you to deploy just one bucket, because without the override, it would say, right, there's something wrong with it. I'm not going to give you any of the buckets. But if there were certain crosswind limitations, like I think it was 10 knots crosswind, and you could engage it below 140 knots with the underwing tanks empty, which is typically the sort of scenario that you would have on landing. So when you were contemplating your final landing, you would assess what's the weather conditions today. Right, okay, I've got less than 10 knot crosswind. So in the event of a thrust reverse failure, I'm going to use override and single engine thrust reverse below 140 knots to slow the aircraft. And if I still haven't slowed enough, then I'll engage the overrun cable about 1,500 feet from the end of the runway. So that's the SOP. What you can see here is with the buckets deployed, they're going to reverse the jet efflux from the cans, the end of the engine, back over the fuselage at the base of the fin. The effect that had was reducing the aerodynamic effectiveness of the fin. So you lost a little bit of directional stability in the mid-range of thrust reverse before the engines had spooled up enough to generate deceleration that would drive the nose wheel harder onto the tarmac, guaranteeing you traction in that way. So my esteemed colleague had a bit of a brain fart, a bit of a coggy, and he had selected both reversers in a normal way after the nose wheel had come to life, having touched down. And he said he was going to use a bit of asymmetric thrust reverse to close the cross drive and effectively get the aircraft ready for this single engine taxi back. But he selected full reverse on one engine. But we'd already briefed the weather conditions, and I was too clever and said, well, it's within the release to service for single engine thrust reverse. It's non-standard. I'll save it as a debrief point. But what happened was, very quickly, we got some lateral drift build up. There'd been a phenomenon identified in some of the trials work where when reverse had been selected and deployed, the aircraft might slightly diverge in a direction that you perhaps wouldn't expect. So if you're powering up on the right-hand engine, you'd expect more retardation to the right-hand side of the center line, and the aircraft would yaw to the right. Well, the aircraft might, in the example I've talked about, might start to yaw left initially, requiring a bit of right pedal just to keep yourself on the center line. But then, of course, the retarding effect of the engine spooling up to max reverse is to pull you right, and you've got right pedal in, which is what I believe happened. So the aircraft very quickly starts to yaw dramatically to the right on the runway towards the edge of the runway, and I can see lights coming past. So the thing to highlight, because this is a fighter bomber, it's not a training aircraft, the back seat's not stepped up in any way. You can see in the picture behind you, Steve, the cockpit is directly the Wizzo, the back seater, or in the case of this sortie, me in the back of the trainer, is directly behind the head box of the guy in the front or the girl in the front. And the view you have to directly in front of the aircraft is down the side of the ejection seat box. So it's quite challenging to land the aircraft from the back seat in sort of light crosswinds or no crosswind. We use the FLIR repeater to kind of give us a warm and fuzzy as we're tracking the extended centerline on final approach, that it's all looking good, and then start to move our head from side to side, either side of the head box, to maintain SA about how close to the edge of the runway is. So we start yawing dramatically to the right, and I'm trying to look at a couple of small magnetic indicators on the glare shield in front of me, which tell me the status of the thrust reverser in the front, and also see how close we are to the edge of the runway as the lights go flicking past. It's north of Scotland, it's 5 o'clock, it's February, so it's kind of dusk. So the lights were helpful. But with a lateral acceleration on my noggin, it was very hard to keep my eyes on these little magnetic indicators. It just made my eyes flick, and I couldn't, watch it very easily. The memory drills in the event of this drift building up on a normal landing was to cancel the reverse and slam to idle. The sim didn't really replicate it, and it wasn't trained. So it was part of the boldface quiz. So the memory items, the vital actions that you had to be able to recite verbatim. But I think it's one thing to write it down, and given it's not trained in the simulator, something else to do it for real. And I'd never had it. I'd flown probably about 2,000 hours on the airplane. I'd never had it happen to me in the front seat. Generally speaking, the feeling amongst the IPs in the back seat was that the person in the front has got the best view to assess and would be best placed to manage this situation. So I had an override switch, which would allow me to either deploy the thrust reverser from the back seat or turn it off. But most of the time it sat in a middle position where it gave authority to the guy in the front. And that's where it was at landing. So I'm going, is he going to cancel reverse? I'm hoping he's going to do this pretty soon, because we're running out of room as we skid to the right-hand side of the runway. And so that the next slide kind of shows that. So at the bottom of the runway, you can see some skid marks here where I'm indicating with the cursor arrow. This is the secondary runway here. The main runway was runway 2305. This is runway 2811. So we yawed dramatically to the right. At one stage, it looked like we were pointing back towards the center line, but then the aircraft yawed back to the right again, and I realized I was out of runway. And you can see the skid marks here have gone down off the main service, and actually I felt the aircraft give a mild lurch as the right-hand main wheel went off the runway into this kind of this pocket between the two runways. And then I know I'm going across the secondary runway. I know somewhere out there are these aerials. The ground is pretty rough. It's kind of tussock grass and stuff like that. And I'm basically going, well, we're going across the runway now, and I can't see what's in front of me. And we're still doing, about 80, 90 knots. And I call for the ejection at that point. So I think what we can see here, this was taken from a helicopter, but I think you can see the perspex fragments from the canopy being removed from the aircraft by rockets. So this is quite a surreal situation, because I have been in the sim on the previous Friday. This is a Tuesday the incident happens. I've been in the sim on a Friday, and it was a training requirement to recognize situations when it was appropriate to eject. So in the sim, I'd had to initiate ejection as the controls had burnt through short finals to land on this very runway. So in the sim, when you pull the handle, the simulator freezes. You can look at the parameters in terms of your height above the surface, your rate of descent, and go, well, yeah, more than a tenth of the rate of descent above the surface. That's probably a successful ejection. You simply push the handle back in, open the canopy, unstrap, and that's the detail over with, generally speaking. And of course, somehow this is going through my mind as it goes through overspeed, that I'm pulling the handle. And of course, things don't stop in reality. So the handle went clunk as I pulled it, like it did in the sim. But there's a pause and then a whoosh as the rockets took the canopy off. oars. And then, yeah, the most mind-bending acceleration as you ride the rocket. I had always got a good posture and made sure I did when I simulated ejection in the simulator. I'm one of the generation of people that did ride a dummy rig with a quarter charge jet provost seat, a cartridge seat back in the early 90s, but they stopped doing it because people injured themselves. But I got good posture, and yeah, so I remember seeing my boots. I remember seeing the rocket flare. My vision kind of closed into like a tunnel, and so I remember seeing my boots, and then the kind of the sky tilted as the seat deployed. I remember feeling some jerks as the various drogues deployed, and then the big jerk as the main canopy deployed, and then the seat, you've got the death grip on the handle, the ejection seat handle, and then as the seat falls away, it finds its way out through your thumb, and there's the seat lying on the grass, or at least one of them. So I look up, and we had some emergency drills to carry out, and these were drummed into us, and all those years and all that repetition made for some solid kind of motor habit patterns on my part. But they simply inflate the life jacket and adopt a parachute landing position. They'd always warned us that if you look down between your feet, you're going to misjudge how quickly the ground comes up to meet you. And I remember looking down initially and going, no, don't do that. Look at the horizon. And so I looked at the horizon. I got a nice view of the Moray Firth to the north of RAF Lossiemouth, and saw how quickly the ground's coming up. And I tucked myself into the parachute landing position with my knees tucked in, my elbows up on the parachute risers, elbows tucked in like that, and going, oh, this is going to hurt. This is going to hurt. But I landed on the grass and rolled out in exactly the way you see paratroopers do in the war movies, or if you watch any of these sort of trials footage, and it worked a charm. And I picked myself up, and I just, it's just one of those surreal moments. I've actually ejected, and I feel fine. I was expecting to have wrecked my back, and I feel fine. I then swear profusely, mostly at my colleague for having, ostensibly got us in this position, and also myself because I failed to rescue the situation. The background: we'd lost the jet 2 weeks before. They'd had a rear fuselage fire, and their controls had burnt through as they tried to make it to Stornoway. So I'm thinking, Christ, that's 2 ejections in 2 weeks. And so, this is where the self-recrimination starts. But because we put the pan call out, the fire service come roaring across the runway and pull up. And this fireman gets out, and he's running up to me just as I take my parachute off. He says, "You all right?" And I went, "Yeah, I think." And he says, looking at the aeroplane and looking at me, he says, "Do you want to shut it down, or shall I?" Because what we can see is the aircraft has gone up to its axles in the grass. It's sat there. The canopy's gone. You can see these ejection gun rods just poking out the top of the front and the rear cockpits. It's sitting there rather forlornly. And I'm feeling bad about how badly I've parked it. And I think, well, he doesn't look very confident either. He gets to practice maybe once or twice a year, lifting us out of the cockpit. We play like rag dolls, and he tries to identify which switches he would use in reality. So this picture shows the ladders that we used. One ladder, because the engine was still running, we braced against this intake in this direction. And then the second ladder, we braced across it, and I climb up the steps. You get the smell of cordite from the ejection rockets. The cockpit displays are all smashed. It looks a bit different without the seats in there. I safe up the master arming switch, and then shut the engines down, and then climb down from the ladder. It's all a bit surreal. And then I see my oppo, who's lying on the grass behind the aircraft. And as the engines spool down, the efflux from the engines is gently sort of making his parachute flutter on the ground. And I think, oh my God, he's hurt. So I start to run towards him, and he says, "Lie down, you idiot." Because people have hurt their back in ejections, and with the adrenaline flowing, they go, "Oh, I'm fine." And all of a sudden they fall over as their spine is finally severed, or whatever. You've got some sort of injury, and it's just the adrenaline that keeps you going. Oh yeah, I should probably lie down at this point, shouldn't I? So I do. And at this point, Gary comes running across the runway. So Gary is a search and rescue crewman because RAF Lossiemouth or at the time had a flight with two Sea King search and rescue helicopters. One was up in the mountains doing some training, and the other one had been being rectified by the maintainers and had just come up on state. But Gary had seen the ejection, grabbed a med pack, and come running across the runway to look after us. Now, Gary had been an avionics technician on 617 Squadron when I'd served my first tour, so I knew him quite well. He was a great lad, and he quite liked the flight crew. He would come and drink with us downtown in Lossiemouth in the nightclubs, and we just really liked the guy. He was switched on. He was very capable. So it was a beautiful bit of serendipity that he's the guy that comes running across the runway and starts to look after us. And of course, after that, they start cutting our equipment off us. They put us on backboards, put us in the helicopter, and fly us to Inverness Hospital.